Well, round, what do we have? Round four or round three? Let's, I hate to say this today, but, after processing the round that concluded last night, the results were kind of scary. Ah, I'll forgive the pun, I guess. Yeah, it was Halloween last night. It was round three, and let's take a look at what happened. Do a little review here. Oops. Usually I do that in the PDF version. Let me go back and see if I can do that. It makes it a little bit larger as we run through it. It takes a little bit longer for it to load, so let's hopefully it will give me a chance to sip on some coffee. There we go. Here we go. Selected financial statistics. Jump and look at the sales first, and look at that. Oh my goodness. Andrews, $241 million. Next closest, Chester, with $150 million. And all the way down to Team Ferris with $70 million. Now, that said, we see some reasonable profits for a number of teams, although once again Andrews kind of double. So even though its sales weren't double Erie's, its profits were, and its sales certainly weren't double Chester's, but way more than double on the profit side. An ROE of 24.3, leverage ratios other than Ferris, but remember theirs was way out of whack. Here's a chance to give Ferris a little credit that they've kind of turned things around here a bit. Because last round was a horrid round for them, and they've got things kind of turned around a little bit. We see really nice contribution margin. That would be somewhat responsible for the profit being quite a bit higher, right? And an SG&A to sales, though, that's a little higher, than some of these other teams. So, but possibly we might conclude that while it's higher, it might have been very effective. It might have been, so, because it generated those kinds of sales. So take a look. Andrews had, a 28% market share, so pretty good sized. Stock market summary. We see a couple teams here getting smaller. Ferris looks like they might have sold a little stock. I don't know if it was this round or prior rounds. Probably trying to generate some cash in any fashion possible. Andrews, which is leading, or profit-wise at least this round, did quite well here. Even though they still have 2.4 million shares outstanding. Stock price is higher, but look at these stock prices aren't that much further behind, given the discrepancy. And the earnings per share, again, remember Andrews had more than double the earnings, or about double the earnings of all these other teams, Erie, Digby, Chester, but Erie, Digby, and Chester did reasonably well in terms of earnings per share. They cut the gap considerably. So, kind of interesting. I didn't look at the ROE and see if they had cut the gap there too. So 24.3. Oh yeah. So even though there's double the earnings, there's the margin of victory for the ROE is quite a bit smaller. Okay. So we cruise down, we take a look, see if, take a glance at debt. I don't see a lot there. Not many teams using a lot of debt. Looks like Andrews has more debt outstanding than any other team, but I still wouldn't call that a lot of debt by any stretch of the imagination. Income, we know. Depreciation, we see a decent amount of depreciation here. So Andrews has gotten bigger. I think we'll see that what they've done is invested quite a bit in not automation, but in some new products, and that's driving their size of their plant, quite a bit bigger, and so they obviously then have more depreciation. Positive numbers, so we had a huge reduction. What this means then, if you look at that, everybody had a positive turn in cash flow, okay, which means that they had huge reductions in inventory, especially Andrews and Ferris. Okay, huge reductions in inventory. We see accounts receivable, yeah, that's going to vary just round to round based on sales and whatnot. Okay, plant improvements. Ooh, so no team made plant improvements, and in fact, Digby and Ferris probably reduced the size of their plant. On the other hand, Andrews made a huge investment. So this is even more frightening. Again, pardon the pun, because the team that won, the team that won, at least in terms of profit, ROE, and some of those things, I don't know the final score yet because I haven't even processed that yet. But the team that did the best above in terms of profit and some of those other factors also made a huge investment, so they were able to do extremely well and make a huge investment. Interesting. A little bit of current debt borrowing. Had some dividends paid by Team Chester. So Team Chester staying small. We had a couple teams buying back stock. Ferris bought back a little stock. I have to say, probably not impactful. That small amount. Long-term debt, had some retirement there. It's interesting. And retirement of current debt, for them, that would have been their emergency loan. Other teams had some small amounts of current debt. Those might have been current portions of long-term debt. That I'm not sure. A decent amount of cash. Everybody had cash, and you see Andrews. So again, looking solid and still having $54 million in cash. Erie, $45 million in cash. Small amounts of inventory. Ferris is still sitting on more inventory than anybody else, but that's not a horrible, by the third round, not a horrible amount of inventory. Probably more than you'd like to see, but it's not egregious. Plant and equipment. So we're seeing Team Andrews become a much bigger team in terms of their total fixed assets, right? Double the size, almost double the size of all the other teams, okay? And total assets as well. Really close to double the size of any other team. Erie's the next closest. But again, they're generating sales. They may need to be that big, okay? You want to be as small as you can to be efficient, but if you're generating those kinds of sales, you may have to be bigger. Accounts payable, we see some current debt. So they're the only team, Andrews the only team really that borrowed money in current debt. For whatever reason, a lot of teams are afraid of leverage. And I'll remind everybody that at 1.8 leverage, we're not even close to the kind of leverage that we could be, right, before I start taking deductions. That'll be a good question. While I'm going through that, I think I'm going to add that too, that leverage will be a good question for the assignment. Okay. Long-term debt. Again, Andrews kind of leading the way there. Common stock, they got a lot more common stock. Remember, they sold some to begin with. Okay, total equity, it's quite a bit bigger team, which is impressive then that their ROE, but that's why these other teams were able to kind of close the gap on the ROE, even though their earnings were smaller, is because they have quite a bit less equity. Okay, quite a bit less equity. Sales, again, we looked that up above. Yeah, the SG&A, I kind of like to look at. So their SG&A was 11.6%, which was pretty high. But look at that. It spent twice as much as any other team. So that's very effective. They generated maybe not quite as much, maybe not quite twice as much in sales, but pretty darn close, right? So they're pretty effective in that spending. Actually, I would say, obviously, it gave them a big lead and a big market share. EBIT, interest, they should be paying a lot more interest because they're the only team that's using a reasonable amount of debt, paying a lot of taxes then as a result. Cool. Andrews is the only team that's really using capacity. So you can take a glance at this and say we still have way, in terms of the whole industry, we still have just tremendous amount of capacity. Andrews the only team that's kind of pushing their capacity a little bit. The other teams have just far and away more capacity than what they need. And so they're paying to keep the lights on, they're paying depreciation on that, they're paying interest. We're not earning interest because of the capacity that they have. Those are things that don't show up. The costs aren't altogether hidden on having that excess capacity, but they're not something that just jumps out at you on the page. And so that's hard to explain. If you're doing this, you're obviously paying some overtime, which you can see down here clearly, right? When you look at the labor costs, it's hard to compare that and make some great comparisons then to that versus the extra cost that you have when you have, for example, Baldwin have that kind of excess capacity. Okay, that's a tremendous cost that just doesn't show up as much. So yeah, we saw that Team Andrews introducing some new products, naming one after a donkey, I was told. Okay. And those introductions of new products has obviously created a reason for them to have more plant and equipment, more assets, all those types of things. Look at that, zero inventory. Now I wonder if they left a lot of money on the table. That I don't know. They might have left a lot of money on the table, but I don't know in terms of actual versus potential. Baldwin too, the only inventory there is a little traditional. Chester a little traditional, a little bit. Oh, they're both in the traditional. Okay, so they had a little bit in the traditional. Digby a little bit in the low end. Erie a little bit in the low end. And Ferris quite a bit on this product. Now this would have been their normal traditional product that was transitioning, and thus probably got caught a little bit. Oftentimes age, right, isn't so good. Spending a lot of extra money on MTBF here for a low-end product, right, which isn't that critical, which also drives their contribution margin down. Yeah, kind of interesting. I like to look at some of the costs up here just to see where we're sitting here. So, we're getting a material cost down there, labor cost, in spite of using 100% overtime, yeah. Their labor cost is one of the lower. Ferris had a low labor cost here, but used a little bit of overtime, and they had the lowest, okay, and close to the same amount of automation. So, in the traditional segment, everybody's kind of competing there in the traditional segment. You can just see all kinds of products that are gathered around there, and it's still drawing some though from outside of that. There's quite a few teams that still stocked out. Okay, probably could have sold a little bit more, not a ton more. Digby and Erie looks like the ones that could have sold a little bit more. Ferris maybe a smidge more. Okay, but they could have sold a couple percent more, which might have made a little bit of difference. See what the prices are, MTBF differences. Interesting age profile. Ooh, look at the money, yeah, that they spent in marketing. Remember, we saw that up above, so they spent substantially more in marketing, which gives a lot higher customer awareness and also in sales and a lot higher customer accessibility. So in that traditional segment, kind of lower price, location, right in the middle, kind of where it's supposed to be. Age, yeah, not bad. MTBF lower, saves money on labor cost, which might be important. Might be, it is important. In the low end, again, Ferris gave up a little bit there, so Ferris could have done better in the low end, which is where they're primarily competing. Okay, Ebb's way back here. Not a lot near the middle, but it looks like some products here might be transitioning in, but it's kind of hard to say. We'll look at the bigger perceptual map when we get down there. Acre, however, was the leading product. Ferris had the most because they had a couple of products competing there, so they ended up with about 26% market share, whereas Andrews only had the one product in there. Looking at pricing, look at that. Acre, the best-selling one, was the highest price really of the low-end products, and yet still sold the most. Big marketing budget, probably a big reason, age a lot closer to the age profile. You know, age is a big deal up here. They want the ideal age to be around 7, okay, and it's a little bit older, but here's one that's less than 3, way closer, okay, way closer, and next year it'll still be closer. You know, if this one's allowed to age a full year, this one's still going to be closer to the ideal age than, well, Dell down here. So age is what the second biggest factor. Yeah, now you got price and you got age, and so while, you know, price, this is a little lower price, age was a little better up here, plus all the money spent on marketing made a huge difference. Okay, and Dell did not sell out. Dell had some inventory left. High end, ooh, look at that. Total unit industry unit demand, so everybody's zeroed out, and we didn't have enough, okay, to meet the industry demand, so we were 300 units short. That's interesting. And yet these all stocked out. Okay, everybody did stock out. We obviously knew that everybody stocked out. So Atom by far, you know, the leading 35%. They sold a little bit of AHA, their new product, down there too, but 35%. Wow. Okay, price was a little bit on the low side. Good. Age, great. Again, spending more money in marketing. You know, they look like they're actually kind of pushing their strategy a little bit. They're being kind of aggressive on their strategy. I wouldn't call it extremely aggressive. Performance, likewise, we didn't meet demand. Interesting. Only looks like about 3 products, you know, that are really competing here in the performance end. And you kind of see where their Baldwin took advantage. You know, Erie kind of gave up some there, it looks like, but only 3 products there in the performance side. Everybody sold out. How did we do in the size? We met demand in the size. Okay, Erie gave up some there too, so, and Digby took advantage. So Erie kind of in a couple of segments gave up. I think they were in one of the upper segments, in the traditional too. Didn't they give up some there? Yeah, in the traditional segment gave up some. And in the high end, in the performance, and in the size, Erie gave up a lot. Okay, it would be interesting to go back and calculate what all they gave up in terms of their sales and their potential. You know, because that's a decent percentage here. You know, they ended up with 20% of the market, and they could have had, you know, about 27, maybe 28% of the market. So a decent amount that they gave up. If we come down here and we look at that, what was that in the? Was that the high end? In the high end, they 21.6, and they could have had 32%. So they gave up over 10% in that market. And here they gave up not a lot on edge, but in the performance or the size one, hang on, they gave up about 3% on the performance, and on the size one, yeah, about 8-9% there. So yeah, a huge amount. Yeah, the perceptual map. Again, we see you know, Team Andrews kind of pushing, trying to push maybe the limits here in terms of location, and that's really important. Again, if you know, I'm looking at this now, and I'm pretty sure that they're doing a differentiation strategy, at least up here in the high ends, and I can tell that because of the way they're pushing these out, you know, as far as they can. Be interesting to see when you know, TQM comes in and you can shorten the period. Okay, a little bit concerned here. We see Baldwin kind of in the no man's land on a lot of these products. You know, really, you know, not close to the ideal positions for a lot of these products. You could say the same thing for Digby. Chester a little bit better maybe. But again, the ideal locations, I mean, the ideal location for size is still down here somewhere below a Gape or Agape. Okay, AHA's in a pretty good position there for the high end, and in the performance, you kind of want to be over here. Okay, middle for traditional. Okay, here I'm going to tell you in the low end, it doesn't matter all that much. If you look at the products, where they're positioned isn't that big of a deal if you look up at the customer demand. So customer buying criteria, I should say. We're seeing some money being spent here. Look at that. Okay, so we've got Andrews, Baldwin, and Chester each saving, 6.5, 7.5, almost 8% in terms of their labor costs. Let's go back up and remember that Andrews was using a lot of overtime, but yet they're still saving, because of their HR, they're still saving 8%. That's huge. They're on $240 million in sales. A contribution margin, I'm just trying to figure, they probably had $150 million in variable costs, of which about 75 or 80 million was probably labor, and they're saving 8%. So they're saving $5.5, $6 million perhaps. Okay, and they spent some money to get there, but these savings will last for rounds to come, for 4 or 5 more rounds to come. TQM starts next round, so there we have it. There's kind of the rundown of where we're at, and maybe at least one question that I've kind of developed. Oh, I'm going to pause for a bit so that I can do the winner and show you guys that. I hadn't even processed that yet. All right, let's take a look, see who won this round. I hate to tell you, but it may not be, unlike last night, it may not be very suspenseful. Speaking of suspense for Halloween, Andrews, best earnings per share. Andrews, best ROE, best contribution margin, best stock price improvement, best profits. They didn't do the best in cash flow. Ferris did, largely because Ferris did a nice job of running off all the inventory they had from the prior round. Strategy, I haven't taken deductions. Sometimes the teams that are doing poorer actually deserve deductions, but the truth of the matter is that usually if they're not following their strategy, they're doing so poor that taking away points from them becomes kind of an exercise in futility. So 98.5 to Erie's 91, so Erie's not that far behind really if Andrews had a couple of deductions. Alas, there are no deductions across the board except for that one leverage that Ferris had, and again they actually way improved on their leverage over the prior round. Just couldn't get it down to the amount that's needed to avoid a penalty. So there you have it. Congratulations to Team Andrews, the winner of round 3 of the competition.